pierced the overcast sky. It was the kind of place that time forgot, where rusted mailboxes lined dusty driveways, and the trees grew so tall and dense they seemed to swallow sound. A faint rustling of leaves, the occasional distant crow, and the low hum of the wind were the only things breaking the uneasy silence. Kara sat in the back seat of her cousin Matt's beat-up pickup truck, her knees pulled up to her chest. The drive to Cold Hollow had been long, with the 3-hour trek winding through desolate stretches of forested highway. Matt had been talking about this camping trip for weeks, insisting that they all needed to get away for a while. Beside her sat her best friend Mia, whose usually bubbly demeanor was muted as she stared out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. In the front, Matt and his childhood friend Tyler were deep in conversation, their voices low and conspiratorial. The plan was simple: a weekend spent camping at an old site Matt claimed he'd visited as a kid. It was secluded, untouched by the crowds that often overtook the popular campgrounds in the area. "No one ever goes there anymore," Matt had said with a grin. At the time, Kara had thought nothing of it. Now, as the truck rumbled down the narrowing dirt road leading deeper into the woods, she found herself gripping the seat tightly, a growing unease settling in her stomach. The sun was nearly gone by the time they arrived, the trees casting long shadows that crept like dark fingers across the ground. The clearing was small, ringed by dense pines that seemed to close in around them. The campsite itself looked abandoned, with an old fire pit in the center surrounded by weathered logs. Matt killed the engine, and the abrupt silence was jarring. "All right, let's get set up," he said, hopping out of the truck with an energy that seemed out of place in the stillness. Kara climbed out reluctantly, her boots crunching on the dry leaves. The air was colder than she'd expected, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her. Mia gave her a small smile, though her eyes betrayed a similar unease. Tyler was already pulling tents from the truck bed, his movements quick and practiced. It was clear he'd done this many times before. As they worked to set up the campsite, the last rays of sunlight disappeared, leaving them in the dim, bluish light of dusk. The forest seemed to grow quieter with every passing minute. By the time the tents were pitched and the fire was crackling in the pit, Kara's nerves were frayed. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, though every time she glanced over her shoulder, the woods were empty. "It's just your imagination," she muttered to herself, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire and the laughter of her friends. Matt and Tyler were swapping stories about past camping trips, their voices rising and falling in easy rhythm. Mia sat beside Kara, poking at the fire with a stick, her eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the circle of light. "Do you guys hear that?" Mia asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The conversation stopped. Everyone froze, straining to listen. At first, there was only the crackling of the fire and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then faintly, a sound drifted through the trees, a low, almost human moan. It was distant but distinct, carrying an unnatural edge that sent a shiver down Kara's spine. "Probably just an animal," Matt said quickly, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Coyotes," Tyler added, though he didn't sound convinced either. They tried to brush it off, but the mood had shifted. The laughter and light-hearted conversation dwindled, replaced by a tense silence. Kara couldn't shake the feeling that the sound hadn't been an animal at all. It had felt wrong, like something imitating a sound it didn't fully understand. As the hours stretched on, the fire burned lower, and the group grew quieter. Matt eventually stood, stretching his arms over his head. "I'm calling it a night. Big day of hiking tomorrow," he announced, forcing a grin. Tyler quickly followed suit, and the two disappeared into their tent. Mia and Kara doused the fire and climbed into their tent, zipping it up tightly. The small space felt suffocating, the air heavy and thick. Kara lay awake for hours, her ears straining for any sound. The forest outside was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that pressed in on her, making her heart race. Just as she was beginning to drift off, a noise jolted her awake. It was faint at first, a distant rustling, but it grew louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, deliberate and slow, crunching through the dry leaves. She held her breath, her pulse hammering in her ears. Beside her, Mia stirred, her eyes wide in the dim light of the tent. The footsteps stopped just outside their tent. Then, a voice, low, raspy, and hollow, broke the silence. Kara, Mia. It was Matt's voice, but something about it was off, stretched and distorted, as if someone else was trying to mimic him. The voice lingered in the cold air like a dark whisper, unnatural and stretched, each syllable weighted with something Kara couldn't name. She clamped her hand over her mouth, her breath hitching as the sound of footsteps circled the tent. Slow, deliberate, the crunch of leaves underfoot was unmistakable. Her heart pounded so hard she feared it might betray her, the steady thud echoing in her ears as she glanced toward Mia. Mia's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror as she shook her head silently, mouthing words Kara couldn't decipher. Kara, Mia. The voice came again, more insistent this time. It sounded closer, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. It was Matt's voice, but Kara knew deep down it wasn't him. Something was imitating him, something that shouldn't be able to speak at all. Mia grabbed Kara's arm, her nails digging in painfully as she pointed toward the tent flap. The zipper was trembling, moving slightly, as if something or someone was toying with it from the outside. Kara wanted to scream, to bolt out of the tent and run, but her body refused to move. She was frozen, paralyzed by the oppressive weight of fear that seemed to suffocate her. The zipper began to slide down slowly. Every metallic click of the teeth separating was agonizingly loud, cutting through the silence of the night. Kara squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to will herself to wake up, to believe this was some awful dream. But the cold air that seeped into the tent as the zipper descended was all too real. Matt, Mia stammered, her voice trembling, though she didn't move. There was no response, only the sound of breathing, heavy, labored, and wet. It was the kind of breathing that seemed wrong, as if the lungs producing it weren't meant to. The zipper stopped halfway, and Kara dared to open her eyes. A shadow loomed outside, tall and twisted, the faint outline of its form illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees. It didn't move, but Kara felt its gaze, a cold, piercing sensation that rooted her to the spot. Then it spoke again. This time, the voice shifted, warping into Mia's own, her name twisting into a mocking mimicry of itself. Kara, let me in. Mia whimpered, clutching Kara's arm tighter, and the sound seemed to provoke the figure outside. The tent shuddered violently as it pressed against it, the fabric straining under an unnatural weight. The breathing grew louder, more erratic, as if the thing outside was excited, feeding off their fear. Stop it, Mia cried, her voice breaking, but the thing didn't relent. Kara scrambled backward, her hands fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of a flashlight, and she seized it desperately. Without thinking, she switched it on and shone the beam toward the shadow. For a moment, it froze, the outline of its distorted body thrown into sharp relief. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every way that mattered. Limbs too long, a head tilted at an unnatural angle, and eyes, dark, hollow void she whispered fiercely, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Together, they unzipped the back flap and stumbled into the frigid night. The forest was impossibly dark, the towering trees casting shadows that seemed to twist and shift as they moved. Kara could hear the thing behind them, its heavy steps crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, faster than it should have been, and its raspy breaths grew louder, closer with every passing second. "Where's Matt?" Mia gasped, her voice panicked. "I don't know," Kara cried, her mind racing. The direction didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was putting as much distance between them and the thing chasing them as possible. The woods seemed endless, the branches clawing at their clothes and skin as they pushed through the dense undergrowth. Kara's lungs burned, her legs aching with the effort of running, but she didn't dare stop. Mia stumbled beside her, her breaths ragged and uneven. A sharp crack split the air, a sound too deliberate to be a branch breaking. Kara skidded to a halt, pulling Mia down behind a fallen log. She clamped a hand over Mia's mouth to stifle her panicked breathing, her own chest heaving as she tried to listen. The forest was eerily silent again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the creature had vanished, and then she saw it. It was standing in the clearing just ahead, its twisted form illuminated by a sliver of moonlight. It wasn't alone. 2 more shapes emerged from the shadows, each just as grotesque and wrong as the first. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking and twisting with each step. One of them turned its head toward the log where Kara and Mia were hiding, its hollow eyes locking onto them with a predatory focus. Kara's breath caught in her throat. They couldn't outrun them, not all 3. She glanced at Mia, whose eyes were wide with terror, and felt a surge of desperation. They had to do something, anything to survive. Before she could think, a low guttural sound filled the air, a growl deep and resonant that seemed to come from all around them. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. It was as if something else had entered the forest, something that even they feared. Kara didn't wait to find out what it was. She grabbed Mia's hand and bolted, the 2 of them running blindly through the trees. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and the creatures let out ear-piercing screeches that echoed through the night. Kara didn't dare look back, her only focus on the faint glimmer of light she could see in the distance. They burst into another clearing, this one unfamiliar, but somehow less oppressive. A faint orange glow illuminated the area, and Kara realized it was coming from an old, dilapidated cabin. The windows were shattered, and the roof sagged precariously, but it was shelter. Without hesitation, she dragged Mia toward it, throwing open the creaking door and slamming it shut behind them. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, the smell of rot overwhelming. Kara collapsed against the door, her body trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Mia was crouched in the corner, her face buried in her hands. Outside, the growling and screeching continued, the sounds growing more distant as the seconds passed. Whatever was out there, it was fighting the creatures, or at least distracting them. For now, they were safe. But as Kara looked around the dark, decrepit interior of the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had only traded one nightmare